know that this is a success because that's Dot Smith. She was there in the first paint department at the Walt Disney Studios. They've now moved to Hyperion Studios. And Dot oversaw the paints. Now, by this time, the animation has advanced to a little bit more beyond black. They're utilizing black, white, and about 3 or 4 shades of gray to fill in these great fun characters. And Mickey and Minnie, we know, are at this point worldwide sensations because you can see Dot's dress. That's Mickey and Minnie. She's wearing a Mickey and Minnie dress. They are that popular. She's sporting the latest Mickey and Minnie couture. So the ladies would step up and help themselves to the black, white, or 3 or 4 shades of gray that they needed to fill in the cells and keep the animation moving. Now, we're all familiar with this particular film, right? Yes. The very first Silly Symphony skeleton dance. Now, can anybody tell me who the noted animator is of this film? Yes, Ub Iwerks, with a couple of gentlemen helping him doing the animation. Now, we draw the pencils out and we draw the pencil drawings. We love our men with pencils. They're brilliant in what they do. But it's really the work of the women that we're seeing on the final screen. The work that is transferred onto the celluloid. It was one woman who did all of and it was referred to as tracing and opaquing at this point. Her name was Mary Tebb. She later was a color model supervisor at the studio, and she left with Ub Iwerks when he went to start his own studio. She also came back to Disney when Ub closed his studio and came back to work to Disney as well. So we have Mary Tebb to thank. She didn't have anybody else helping her. Mary Tebb is the woman behind everything you're seeing on that screen for Silly Symphonies, the first Silly Symphonies with the skeleton dance. When you come Sunday, I'll be speaking, and I've got great clips, and you can see their work in action. Now, by 1932, the Hyperion Studios are a boom town. Even though there's a depression going on, it's a heyday at Disney Studios. In the lower right, we see Hazel Sewell. Now, Hazel is probably one of the most unsung women in the history of animation. Hazel oversaw, she's the first woman to head a major department in animation. She's also the first person to say, you know what, women are better at this. So, because men were tracing and opaquing and blackening in the early days. But it was such the final thing you were seeing on screen, so there was no room for error. Everything had to be exacting, and she recognized that the women are a little bit better with this. So she split her teams, and she recognized that there was a need for artistry. We will have tracers, but the tracers then evolved into the fine art of inking, which is almost calligraphic in what these women were accomplishing. And then we will have opaquers, or painters. We're still working with black, white, and 3 or 4 shades of gray. Now, in the upper right, we recognize this particular Silly Symphony, yeah? Flowers and Trees. Now, what few people realize is that particular film was actually created twice. It was completed contractually to meet their brand new contract with their new distributor. Roy wrote to them saying, look, we've got this particular Silly Symphony we're working on. We want to move into color. We want to try it on this. If you give us a little bit of a delay, we will create it per our contract, but we want to try it in color, and we'll run it for you and see what you think. So they did just that. They pushed back the deadline. The ladies created the film entirely in black, white, and 3 or 4 shades of gray. Once it was safely through camera, they literally took every cell and carefully washed off all of the black, white, and 3 or 4 shades of gray. The inking was on the front side, the painting would be on the back side. Washed every cell off, and we're talking about 12,000 to 15,000 cells. And then with 80 colors that they were able to pull off of the shelf from hardware stores and whatever place they could find, think about it, paints used to paint houses, they had to feel their way with how this was going to look and convey with the 3-strip Technicolor lights and color process. So within a matter of weeks, they transformed a black, white, and 3 or 4 shades of gray colored film to a colored, full Technicolor 3-strip Technicolor animated short. This film, then, they screened them together and said, all right, we want color. Finally, as Walt put it, we could put a rainbow on the screen, right? We can make color part of our storytelling. So this film then was placed in theaters, went on to win the first Academy Award issued for animation. Not so much for the animation, but the color. It was these women we owe this to. This is the team of women artists working at Disney Studios at this point who are behind the color of Flowers and Trees. Now we know that's Hazel Sewell there on the right. In the front, she's sporting her 1932 Olympics blazer. It was in Los Angeles at that point. They are celebrating Mickey and Minnie's 4th birthday in 1932. If you see the very tall woman in the back with the short bob blacked hair, that is Marcelique Gardner. She was one of the earliest voices of Minnie Mouse. And then, of course, Hazel there. And yes, those are the studio cats climbing up on the, on the cake. If you recall from the previous slide, there was the giant Mickey Mouse neon sign above the studio. Well, it was a depression, and people were having a hard time keeping their animals fed, so they thought, oh, they have a big mouse problem there. Let's leave our cats there. So they would leave them over the wall, and the women of ink and paint would take care of them. So a pretty astounding group of artists. And again, these were the women behind the transition into color. So by 1934, Walt realizes we've got to do more with animation. It can't just be gags, prep, gags, and falls. He's advancing it towards feature animation storytelling. Now, the two ladies on the left are the first story artists ever, female story artists at Disney Studios. Bianca Majoli in the upper left, exquisite artistry, some of the most beautiful, delicate story pieces that she helped to develop for even early Peter Pan concepts. She did Baby Weems, the Baby Weems story. Really wonderful, brilliant artistry. And then underneath her is Grace Huntington. And what's unique about Grace, not only as the second female story artist at Disney Studios, Grace was a pilot. There were a lot of women pilots at the studio. But what's unique about Grace is she held a world record in altitude. How crazy is that, right? She couldn't get a job because, say it with me, she was a woman. Right? This is in the 30s in aviation. She held a world record and no one would hire her. So she thought she'd try that other thing she was pretty good at. And sure enough, good enough, she was the second female story artist at Disney Studios. Walt was like, you, great, bring it in. And he would sit with her and say, look, it's a little tough in the story room. The guys get physical, they're rambunctious, they let off steam, they swear. He was helping her to get in the mix because he wanted her contributions. Same is true with Bianca Majoli. Upper right is, these on the right side then are story artists, or story writers. Now, Dorothy Ann Blank in the upper right, she was actually one of the early women writers in Hollywood, beyond Disney, first woman coming in as a writer. What's unique about Dorothy is she gets story credit on Snow White. She wrote early scenarios and exploring where animation could go, and did early story treatments and character developments. She was actually also used as the model for the Evil Queen. She loved that. She thought that was great. And we have Lillian Granger and Mary Goodrich, who were early story researchers. Again, this is the mid-30s. We do not have the internet at that point. So these ladies used things called books and helped to research what would happen for the story. So a fascinating factory of story. Now, here we get to some really great groundbreaking work. Mary Weiser was a painter at Disney Studios. She decided, as you heard me mention, they were using paints that were like from hardware stores and any kind of colors, 80 colors they were working on trees. Mary decided they had continual problems because they're working on nitrate cellulose, which is a highly flammable material. But in order to get the paints to be properly opaqued or translucent if needed, the paints were continually problematic. If it was like a humid, sticky, rainy day today, the paint would never dry. Or it would, if it was a hot, dry day, it would dry too quickly and they couldn't blend it, or it would start separating if you were mixing colors. Mary said, look, I think we can do better. So she went to Walt and Hazel and Roy and said, I want to try creating our own paints. Absolutely. So she took it upon herself, traveled, did the research, learned chemistry, got a degree in chemistry, and created the first and only paint lab to create and design paints exclusively for cell animation anywhere in the world. One woman. This was not Betty Crocker's kitchen. This was a full-out lab. It was Madame Curie's lab. She had a team of women who were chemists working with her. When you recall going from 80 colors on flowers and trees to 1,500 colors for Snow White, under the guises of Mary Weiser. They developed all of the ink pads and bloopers inks for the sound department. So I even found a formula that the women created for hand lotion, because they'd have to keep their brushes and everything clean, yet for inking and painting they needed a smooth, clean arc to their work. So you didn't have Target or CVS or anything to run to pick up a jar of Jergens. These women developed their own formula. So pretty remarkable work. It is through that work and artistry we go from the 80 colors of flowers and trees to the 1,500 colors and the multi-plane approach of the old mill. And it's Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston who said, we didn't think we could do a feature animated film until we saw what the women accomplished on the old mill. The palette that was utilized was unheard of. And in fact, later on, the paint lab created up to 2,800 colors, more colors than what were available anywhere in the world. Remarkable teams. Now, take a look here. By 1937, we've got on 1935, we have Who Killed Cock Robin. Look at Jenny Wren's cheeks. They're ovals, essentially. And the inker would ink in the same color, an oval, and then a painter would fill that in, so that would imply a cheek. Walt wanted believability in his artistry moving into a feature animated film. He knew if the audiences were going to sit for an hour and a half, they needed something much more believable. Mary and her team of artists developed, now there's a lovely myth talking about the girls putting on makeup on the cells. It's a myth. They developed a dye technique, and it was a combination of orange and pink dyes. And the women, there were a select group of women who you would inject it into the pores of the dye, and then before they even had Q-tips, Mary developed an early crude industrial Q-tip, and they would blend this dye into the front side of the cell to give it a natural look, and then would have to animate that across thousands of cells. So this term of color animation has always been here, but we've never applied it. In fact, I found documents on it, and it was the women. You see the highlights in her hair. The women were moving the color just as the men would move the pencil lines. We have women working with permanent inks and paints. There's a great classic line about Fred Astaire that Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did backwards and in high heels. These women did everything the men with pencils did. Backwards on permanent cells with ink, paint, and yes, in high heels. So Mary actually holds a couple of patents for her blend technique, and then developing the sticks that they would use, these industrial sticks, to apply this. And it forever transformed animation. We have women working in backgrounds. The first female background artist is Marion Wiley Sturrett, who worked beginning work on Pinocchio. In the late 30s is an extraordinary time for women in animation at Disney Studios. And Walt was highly progressive with where women were and how they advanced all throughout early animation. It was a wonderful discovery to make. Now, if we can get this to progress, here we go. All right. Let me start from left to right. Geo Fujikawa was one of the first artists working in consumer products. Remarkable artist, on the same par, and in many ways sort of beyond Mary Blair, but yet we don't know much about Geo Fujikawa. Look her up, she's amazing. Upper left is Shirley Soderstrom, who came and was sculpting many of the color models that were utilized, the maquette models that the artists would use to see the characters in a three-dimensional context. Let's continue from Geo down along the bottom, and then we'll circle back up. So Geo along the bottom on the left, underneath her is Barbara Worth Baldwin, who ran the airbrush department. She had over 20 men and women working under her, applying the airbrush techniques to much of the great animation from the late 30s into the early 40s. Underneath, to her right then is Sylvia Holland, Faith Ruckus, and Ethel Kulsar. These are extraordinary story artists who are largely behind much of what we know in Fantasia. It truly is a woman's film. And when you see so many of those segments, it's these three ladies plus others who are behind that. And then on the far right is, above her is Viola Anderson, who is the first female in-betweener. And underneath her is Mildred Rossi, who was one of the first women animators and also a color animator. If you come on Sunday, you'll see some really brilliant examples of these amazing women. Now, from the top, Shirley Soderstrom then, sculpting. In the middle on the top is Louisa Fields, who is the first female music editor in Hollywood. Hollywood. Stop. Walt brought her in on Fantasia. So, remarkable woman right there. And then Peggy Johnstone, another story artist, really great story artist who, again, on the same par as Geo Fujikawa and Mary Blair. Incredible women. I urge you to seek out their work. Now, by 1940, we moved to the Burbank studios. So it's really an amazing campus, and women were everywhere. We think back on our history, and we know about Mary Blair, but again, thousands of women in every department at this point. All right. It's been a while. Let me see if I can get these top to bottom. Bea Tamargo. She was from South America, Latin American artist, brilliant animator. These are women wielding pencils, by the way. Retta Scott, you may have heard of her. She did a little thing called Bambi. And then Phyllis Mooney Williams on the top row in the orange frame. Phyllis Mooney Williams did a lot on Lady and the Tramp and many of the other great later films. Ray Medby McSpadden started in ink and paint as a painter on Snow White and worked her way up. In the early 1940s, Walt had a training program for the women because the war was happening. So we had Rosie the Riveters with riveters in factories. We had Rosie the Riveters with pencils at Disney Studios, which is really exciting. Ray worked with Frank Capra on the Why We Fight series. She also worked on Victory Through Air Power. And during the war, she was trained as a night watcher. So she would literally do shifts going up on the roofs, and she could identify aircraft. So remarkable women. On the bottom, Jerry Beaumont, an incredible animator. Again, this is going back to the 40s, late 30s, 40s. Velen Sewell, who was also a pilot. She would get up and fly her plane up to the Big Bear area, and she was loved being out in the woods and then fly back and pick up her pencil and animate. Jane Fowler Boyd, there in the middle, or yellow frame at the bottom, she is working actually on Maleficent. She animated on Sleeping Beauty, worked with Mark Davis. She was also a reference model for Maleficent. Retta Davidson, the other Retta, is a remarkable, she started in the 40s and continued on, and she trained many of our great legendary animators today. Andreas Deja, Glenn Keane, Mark Henn. We owe to that lady right there, Retta Davidson, and then Sally Holmes, another really remarkable animator. These just scratch the surface. Women were everywhere in every aspect of animation, of Disney animation. And Disney was a leader in getting women placed. I've been researching into the other studios at these points, not nearly on the level as Disney was. Now, ladies in the cutting room. Bea Selk on the left there, she started as an ink and painter and worked her way up into music editing. Nelda Marshall, upper top, and then Wanda Elvin Sykes. She was also a songwriter. She wrote under the pen name of Sam Sykes at Disney Studios. Gloria Hamilton on the left, Shirley Gross was a negative cutter in the middle. And on the far right bottom is Evelyn Kennedy, who trained a couple of green young songwriters by the name of Sherman Brothers. She's the one who brought them in and said, this is how your music will work with animation, and trained them, and literally took Richard under wing. He was so excited to talk about, I have to tell you about the amazing Evelyn Kennedy. Incredible, incredible ladies. Lengthy careers, remarkable accomplishments. Now, we have to, of course, acknowledge the ladies of voice, left to right, and we sadly just lost June Foray this year. June was legendary. You've heard of Witch Hazel, and she did Granny and Tweety for some other studio. June also did work for Disney Studios quite a bit. She was one of the mermaids in Peter Pan. She was Grandma Fa in Mulan. Legendary voice artist. She fortunately did the foreword for the book, and an amazing lady. We owe where we are in terms of ASIFA and many of the guilds and organizations for animation, the Annie Awards, which will be coming up in a couple of weeks. That's thanks to June Foray. In the middle is Betty Lou Gersten. Any guesses who she voiced? Cruella de Vil. Yeah. Verna Felton there on the upper right. She was, of course, the fairy godmother and one of the elephants in Dumbo. Great, classic, wonderful voice. Adriana Casalati on the back to the left on the bottom row. Great Catherine Beaumont, of course, our dear Alice from Alice in Wonderland, and Wendy from Peter Pan. Legendary Mary Costa, the voice of Princess Aurora. And then Eleanor Audley as the voice of Maleficent and the wicked stepmother in Cinderella. So remarkable ladies of voice. Now, I would be remiss if we did not explore the amazing Mary Blair. Yeah, yeah. And we owe so much to her artistry. She's there with Helen Siebert at the Paint Lab and worked very closely with the women to match the colors that Mary was striving for. And Mary could work color unlike anybody, even today. There are still some really wonderful lady artists and men artists who strive to kind of achieve that Mary Blair-esque quality, but she's unsurpassed. Really, really, truly remarkable. I understand there's a documentary in the works on Mary, too. So by the mid-1950s, this is pretty much the ink and paint department, but these are the women behind Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, right? Sleeping Beauty, right? Pretty remarkable. Take a look along the back. There are a few gentlemen in there. Yes. So it wasn't all women, and it wasn't, as they call it, a pink ghetto by any means. There's a lot of incredible artistry and activity happening, not only in ink and paint, but in the adjoining building across the way, in the animation building, women were wielding pencils as well, and had been since the mid-30s. So there are lots of myths that are really exciting that we can finally bust. But what's unique about the 1950s, take a look at this stunning, stunning ink work. We really see the height, the zenith of the hand-rendered artistry of inking. And Walt, I think, really embraced it and loved it, but it was so costly having these women trained, and they were paid a premium for their skills. Now that is a paperclip from Walt's desk, a 1-inch paperclip from his story meeting notes. They were so great. I said, you guys, I need something to show scale. Oh yeah, how about a paperclip? So that is from Walt's meeting notes. Now, take a look at the size. The women could get the artistry down to 1/2 inch without losing detail. 1/2 inch. That's, when you see the prince on horseback, that's a prince on horseback. That's not a dot in the distance when Aurora's in the forest singing to her heart's content. Look at these. Let me give you a little closer example. There is every ruffle on those fairies. Every expression is there. Do that over the course of thousands of cells for each scene, right? Make that match time and time again. color match. Now, the other thing that I'm going to throw into the mix here to understand about what the women were accomplishing. Cells were on levels. You could accomplish with 4 levels, standard setup. And so you might have Donald Duck in a scene, and he's only going to have part of him moving, but that's going to be on the 2nd level. And maybe you have another part moving on the 3rd level. So you're going to have Donald Duck Blue 1, Donald Duck Blue 2, Donald Duck Blue 3, and Donald Duck Blue 4, because the cells have a color cast. So not only do you have the rubric of, or the artistry, the line work that you've got to match, and the colors have to match too, but you also have to consider the layer that you're working on and what phase of color that is. So there's this incredible mind-blowing rubric of what has to be accomplished, hence the checking department. So there's much more happening than pretty girls tracing and coloring. Here we go. So with the extreme cost involved with the fine art of inking, in order to save animation, iWorks steps in, has a chat with Walter and Roy, and he modifies the Xerox process. Xerox had been around, but says, all right, let's see what we can do with this. And he designed the original cameras, and they're still at the Disney Studios. It's essentially 3 rooms. And like what we have on our desktop today as our printers is essentially 3 rooms with a team of about 8 or 10 people working in coordinating to get scenes through. Now, it completely revolutionized. It was a tremendous cost saver. And you'll note the time period. I love the mini skirts there, right? Definitely in the late 50s, early 60s. But it required an entirely different approach to the animation process, more of a layered approach. So it required changes to art direction as well as style and how color is being applied. So hence we arrive at 101 Dalmatians. But this really is, in Walt's time period, this really truly is the level of artistry and accomplishment, and particularly color, where women really have made tremendous, groundbreaking advances. And yet, for some reason, we don't look at that. We don't talk about it. So, time to turn that page and examine where women have been and what their accomplishments were within Walt's lifetime, keeping in mind that there were thousands of women. And I got to literally scratch the surface in the giant book that this is based on. But the research continues, and there's more stories, more extraordinary women. And someday I'll be speaking more at length here in this room for about an hour and a half. I have film clips. We get to go a little more in depth into some of these women and what their accomplishments were. You'll get to see examples of that. So I'd love to have you come back and enjoy more of that. And all of this, of course, is woven into a little tiny book. Okay, not so little tiny book. Ink and Paint, the Women of Walt Disney's Animation. So, any questions?